Welcome, everyone. I'm Jessica Collins, Executive Director of the Public Health Institute of Western Mass. And really happy and grateful everyone could join us today to learn about the new mass gun law. Gun violence and fatalities are a public health crisis across our region, and we are grateful to our speakers today, Chair González, our state representative from the 10th Hamden District, Deputy Chief Kent of Springfield Police Department, and Dr. Kathy Mague of Behavioral Health Network, who will share with us what this new law entails and how it will be operationalized to prevent the tragic loss of life in our communities. The speaker bios are available on the event landing page. And some quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Please put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function, and we will discuss those during our question and answer period towards the end. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording and the slides with all of you who registered, as well as have it available up on our website next week. The Zoom function show captions anyone can use that to enable automatically generated closed captioning. And before you sign off today, we will be asking people to fill out a very quick survey to tell us how it went and how we can do better next time. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Chair González, and again, just very grateful for your leadership on this issue, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good afternoon, I should say, because it's 12:02, and Happy New Year to those that I haven't seen. Thank you, BHN and Jessica, Stephen, and or Deputy Chief, I should say, Kent, and also Kathy, for being part of this panel. It's an honor to be here with you and addressing some of the issues that have impacted our lives, not only yesterday, but for so many years, and that's gun violence. The process that we took at the legislature, after, again, looking at statistics over statistics, not only in Massachusetts, but obviously a large impact here in the city of Springfield, where I represent, as well as nationwide, and that is gun safety legislation. And I think it's important to note that that's what this legislation has been trying to address. How do we not impede on anybody's Second Amendment rights, but make sure that we can provide a process and policy that can protect lives, not only from individuals, from themselves, but also protecting the lives of many residents that have been impacted negatively by gun violence. The process, as we took it upon on the legislature, again, took a 2-year period. And as you know, we went across the state, going to every major communities that have been impacted by gun violence, but also those that hadn't been impacted by gun violence. And when we look at some of the statistics, what we were seeing that many individuals that were impacted by guns, particularly in rural areas, was not having the same effect as those that were being impacted by cities like Springfield, which was due to gun violence, where we saw in rural areas a higher incident of individuals hurting themselves with guns, including suicides. And we saw individuals using guns illegally in cities like city of Springfield. The process started with an attempt to jointly address the issues of gun violence through the legislative process with the Senate and the House. Shortly thereafter, the House took it upon themselves to open up a hearing where we heard from individuals that were, again, pro or against gun safety legislation. And again, that was after a long period of time going across the state and listening from individuals in their different regions. The House took this bill up first, and we passed what we thought was sensible gun control legislation. Obviously, there were some pros and cons during that process. We heard that loud and clear. And then after a period of time, the Senate took it upon themselves to determine what was, in their minds, the best interest of moving gun legislation forward. Again, that process was criticized as well as supported. And then we had the conference committee, which is part of the legislative process as we know it in Massachusetts, where we come together and try to highlight some of those concerns that have been addressed, but as well as make sure that we came up with sensible gun control. One of the key elements of that process was to make sure that we did not impede on anybody's Second Amendment rights. And some people may disagree, but I think we did a very good job in making sure that not one gun was removed from a legal gun user in Massachusetts since this legislation has been passed. And that definitely was something that was concerning to many of those that we got emails from. But again, not one person gun was removed from their homes or their possession because of this gun legislation. The concentration of this legislation concentrating and saving lives, not only those in inner cities, but also those who had concerns. We had concerns with mental health issues, and we see how rampant that has been across the country. One thing that we recognize is that all mass murders in the United States, 97.3% of those were committed by legal gun users and people that were impacted by, many times, mental health issues. Red flag laws were expanded on who can call in an extreme risk protection order. Sometimes we saw that many individuals, particularly in the medical professional field, were restrained from being able to highlight when they saw individuals that were having issues in their personal life or have gone through some bad times and in possessions of weapons, and they could have been harm to themselves or to the general public. So we expanded what was already risk protection orders in Massachusetts to expand again more in the field of medical professionals as well as those in our schools. And that is in consultation with the administration of our school departments to make sure if a teacher recognized, heard, or a student complained about an issue that was concerning to the general health of a school, that they can call in that concern to not only the medical professionals, but also to law enforcement to review that process. Once that process is made, there's also a requirement for court orders. So there's not one person determining that concern and it being adjudicated. It had to go through a process, and that was the courts. We also, in addition, had prohibiting carrying firearms in schools, polling places, and government buildings, which again, even in the State House, when we go in, we're checked for any type of weapons, and government buildings have been protected for a long time, and we feel that our schools needed to also have that protection in place, regardless of individuals not in law enforcement that have the legal rights to carry their weapons. So those buildings now are prohibited regardless. But that does not expand to our law enforcement divisions. We also added a tool that I think is critical and important to safeguarding the rampant use of weapons across this country, and that is the illegal use of weapons, particularly the illegal sales of weapons, and that is to track and trace. And the experts really here are Ms. McGuire and Deputy Chief Kent on how to treat gun violence, but also the impact of gun violence. And I'm sure you'll hear more from them. But when it comes to track and tracing, my statistics that I've gathered is that approximately 90% of the weapons used in the illegal crimes in the city of Springfield have serial numbers. And yes, there are some that are being used that have been created that we call and refer to now as ghost guns. But many of the weapons are used, have serial numbers, and we should be able to track and trace those weapons. And I think we need to do a better job, and that was a push that we implemented in this legislation. But again, it's something that we're going to continue to try to get more data from our local law enforcement, as well as our DAs and the state police, to get more track and tracing. Because when I went to Smith & Wesson, they know before a weapon leaves that place, they have a serial number and it has a patent, and they can A&F can trace that weapon from where it went to what gun shop, to what state, to what legal sale that occurred, whether from one person to another, and that should be able to be track and trace. Now, many of the track and tracing that I have heard and received is that it comes from Vermont, particularly in Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Yes, but somebody legally bought that gun in New Hampshire or Vermont in that estimation. And if they bought it from a different state, that should be tracked and traced. So we want to really concentrate on that. And I think that would go a long way to stop the illegal sale of weapons and be able to also stop individuals who have the legal authority to purchase guns to sell any of their weapons to somebody that does not have a license. And every town, the chiefs of police, superintendents, should have a list of who has weapons legally in their towns. And that's why we're able to hopefully track and trace more to be able to find out where these guns went from a legal gun to an illegal sale. Including in this legislation, we added training, the standards of training that require live fire component as part of the licensing process. And I went to the gun stores and met with them, and kudos to the ones here in West Springfield, which is closer to our home here, is that they already require fire live training when selling a weapon. So we think that's critical and important because it's no different than driving. You don't get a license unless you take a training, unless you know how to use that automobile and know how to drive. We feel that and confident that many individuals agree with us on the live fire component for the licensing process. And then we put some stipulations on the requirements of firearms to be registered and ban the use of 3D printers to manufacture guns. What we have found, the increase of the use of ghost guns, is that they're being manufactured locally, and under the Constitution, we did not want to infringe on the part that individuals as a hobby can build their own weapons. But we feel that it's important that those guns need to be registered because that is the law. And failure to do that will have some consequences now because we have some mandatory requirements, but also mandatory minimum sentencing that will go along with those who fail to register the gun or make these manufactured ghost guns. We also broke down the local licensing authorities that may refuse to grant a permit or license to someone that is perceived to be a threat to public safety. And again, that's giving the local authorities who have more boots on the ground, individuals in our law enforcement divisions that know the communities more so than any statewide agency that can oversee that process. That in a nutshell is, big part of what this bill is. Now, we did have some mandatory sentencing for those trafficking in weapons, because people criticized us for some time about not being strong on the illegal use of weapons. And I tend to, push back on that, because we have mandatory sentencing for trafficking in weapons from any other state to Massachusetts. There's mandatory minimum sentencing. There's also mandatory minimum sentencing when it comes to the sale of weapons to an unauthorized person. And we also have the bump stocks, which were items that were able to be connected to a weapon that would turn that into an assault weapon. And again, we didn't want to infringe on the part of anybody that was using, that were hobbyists or were using weapons for hunting, or any of the hobbies that may occur, shooting between parents, on teaching their kids how to use weapons in a legal and safe way. We try to address all those concerns through the legislative process, and we think that this landmark legislation, which as I travel the country, is really being looked at in many other states now by some of my colleagues in government who has reached out, because they see some sensible gun legislation without impacting the Second Amendment rights.
Thank you so much, Chair Gonzalez. That was very comprehensive, and I appreciate how thorough the 2 years was, and it sounds like you spoke with many different stakeholders. So thank you again for your leadership and you walking us through that today. And now I would like to turn it over to Chief Deputy Stephen Kent, talk from obviously police department perspective around operationalizing this new law with those new components.
Okay, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Just before I get started, everything that I say here is coming from the context of within the city of Springfield and the problems that we deal with here. And when I refer to any sort of enforcement actions we take, I'm referring to actions taken against people who are possessing these firearms or these items illegally. We at the Springfield Police Department obviously are not interested in investigating any lawful gun owner for anything that the new gun law may or may not allow us to do. These, when we use these new gun laws to help us keep the city safe, we're targeting gang members, shooters, people that these repeat offenders that commit, probably 95% of the crime in this city could probably be attributed to 2 or 3% of a select group of bad guys. So that's where we're coming from here in the city and here at the police department. I've been in the Springfield Police Department since 1992. I did guns, drugs, and gangs as a detective, a sergeant, and a lieutenant for well over 20 years. So I know a little bit about what's going on the street. I can tell you that, like anything else, things change. Bad guy methods change. The technology changes. So there's always some sort of flux there that we as a police department have to adjust to. And I think this new law, at least some components of it give us the ability to adjust and to better enforce or better target these individuals that need to be targeted to keep the city safe. There's a little bit of background on the police department. A couple of years ago, when the courts and society in general started to have kind of a new attitude towards drug crimes, and seem to be placing less importance on drug crimes. We at the Springfield Police Department, specifically former Commissioner Cheryl Clapprood, we restructured our narcotics unit and we turned it into a firearms investigation unit. And the reasoning behind that was not that drugs aren't doing serious and irreparable damage to the society, to our society and in our city. It was that we were having a real problem with gun violence, and we needed to take these actors off the street because when you're shooting a gun in a thickly settled residential area, those bullets may or may not hit the person you're trying to hit, which is not acceptable, but they may hit somebody you're not trying to hit, somebody who's trying to walk to the bus stop or come home from the bus stop or sitting in a chair in their apartment. And we really felt that we needed to prioritize these people who are legally carrying firearms and using them to terrorize the city. So we formed the FIU, we Firearms Investigation Unit, and we altered some of our methods of investigation to keep up with technology and things of that nature. And we've been very successful in that, in taking guns off the street through this unit and through these new investigative means. But a couple of years ago, and I'll go back to probably around 2022, we have ShotSpotter in the city. And ShotSpotter is a system of microphones, and whenever there's gunshots fired in the areas that are covered by ShotSpotter, you receive a notification either on your cruiser in your computer or on your cell phone that shots have been fired, to give you the exact location so we can respond there in a timely fashion. But a couple of years ago, I want to say starting in 2022, we started hearing in, automatic gunfire as opposed to the normal semi-automatic gunfire, and they're very distinguishable, automatic from semi-automatic. So we started to wonder why we're having automatic weapons popping up on the city streets, right? So the answer to that was they're called sear switches on the street. They're called Glock switches. And what it basically is a little piece that attaches to the back of your semi-automatic firearm. And it can convert that firearm from semi-automatic, which is one bullet for every pull of the trigger, to automatic, which is pull the trigger once and you empty the clip, right? So you combine that with, we're seeing a significant increase in crime scenes where we're picking up 30, 50, in one case over 100 shell casings in a residential neighborhood. And the reason for that was A, the Glock switches, and B, extended magazines. I imagine they probably get them online or from another state, but they're getting 50 round magazines and discharging all those rounds with a single pull of the trigger, right? So now you have 50 rounds coming out of a firearm, probably in under 2 or 3 seconds. Anybody who knows anything about handguns knows that they're very difficult to control under any circumstance. But when you put them and make them fully automatic, they're almost impossible to control. So what you have is, in the case of a 50 round magazine, you have 50 projectiles headed downrange and no way of controlling where they end up. So that was a real problem. And the problem was, if the Glock switch or the sear switch was attached to an illegal firearm, well, that's fine, right? You arrest the person for the firearm. You can make the machine gun charge if you want. In my experience, they weren't getting prosecuted at machine guns. This new law gives us the ability to target the people that are selling the Glock switches, because now the switch in and of itself is a felony, so that we can target those people whether or not they've attached it to a firearm. And we have done that. We did one here just the other day where we did search warrants on a fellow who was selling Glock switches, 3D printing firearms. He was a legitimate, and this is rare in the city, but he did have an LTC. But he was he was obtaining Glock switches, selling them on the street. He was 3D printing his own gun components. We were able to target him for that. Any firearm that he legally had at the time, not anymore, because he had a license to carry firearms. But under this new law, he didn't have the right to possess those switches or the components that he was making on his 3D printer. So those are the two components of this law that I've seen utilized in the city of Springfield, that we're actually we're happy to use any tool you give us when it comes to violence on the street. And as a point of reference, I could tell you that in 2023, there was 4,144 shell casings recovered from Springfield streets in a 1-year period. 4,144 shell casings. And that doesn't account for the shell casings that stayed in the car or went down the storm drain or, got stuck in tire treads and just were never found. In my opinion, that's probably, that 4,141 shell casings is probably about 85% of the shots that were fired in the city that year. And it also doesn't include shots fired incidents where we don't have shot spotter and nobody calls 911 and those go unnoticed. But 4,141 is a substantial amount of shots fired in a thickly settled area. And the reason that we attributed that was up almost 2,000, just under 2,000 from the year before. And the reason we attribute that to the Glock switches and the large capacity magazines, because you're just one pull of the trigger and you're unleashing 50 rounds or 30 rounds or whatever your magazine holds. So we started to crack down on the Glock, the people with the Glock switches in the high capacity magazines. We were able to lower that number of recovered shell casings to 3,865 for 2024, which is nowhere even in the neighborhood of an acceptable number, but it does represent, I'm no mathematician, but somewhere around about a 10% decrease. So we're heading in the right direction. And with this, with the ability to target the people that are selling these switches, to convert these handguns to fully automatic on the street, with the ability that this law gives us to target them just for that. They don't have to have it attached to a firearm. They don't have to be in possession of a legal firearm. They just have to be in possession of the Glock switch. And I think that's going to help us bring those numbers of recovered shell casings, shooting victims, shots fired incidents. Hopefully it's going to help us bring them down. The other issue we had, and the representative addressed this, is the ghost guns. I mean, it is roughly probably about 10-15% of the guns recovered are ghost guns in the city. That being saying that they were manufactured outside of the normal process with a 3D printer, or there are actually companies that sell these components online without serial numbers, and you can get them through the mail. So roughly 15 to 20%, I think. Yeah, 15 to 20% are ghost guns. And now with the advent of 3D printing, our fear was that number was going to go up. That anybody with any rudimentary knowledge of technology and 3D printing can print themselves a firearm, or most of the components of a working firearm, and sell those on the street, or use them for whatever nefarious purposes of their own. I think with this new law, and the ability to go after these people for 3D printing guns, which I think that we probably had the ability to do that before, as far as if you're putting together a working firearm, yeah, we can come looking for you if you're making ghost guns. But just the fact that you can't have these components under this law gives us just another avenue to disrupt the people that are living in this arena of buying guns, selling guns, shooting guns illegally on the street. And that's who we target. when I read this law, those were the two main things that I think are going to help us the most in the city of Springfield. Getting these switches before they actually are attached to a firearm and hit the street, and disrupting the manufacture and the sale of these 3D printed or ghost handguns. I think that's going. I don't think, I know that the ability to disrupt those two avenues that our criminals have been exploiting is going to make the city safer, and it's going to make my officers safer, make the public safer, and hopefully make these neighborhoods a little more livable for the people that live there.
Okay, thank you so much, Deputy Chief Kent. Appreciate that perspective. And now we'll have Dr. Kathy Mague talk from the behavioral health perspective and the red flag component.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. A huge thank you to Chair González for your tireless work on behalf of our communities, and congratulations on the passing of this legislation. You really did due diligence to engage all of the stakeholders and get a broad perspective of the issues here and get them included in this legislation. So thank you. As Jessica said, I'm here to speak on the behavioral health considerations involved in the legislation and in becoming compliant with it. Just want to say a word, and I know many of you on the webinar have history, context, professional and lived experience in this field. I just want to say my context for speaking on this, as you can see in the bios, is that, but I've worked in community behavioral health in Springfield for over 25 years, overseeing our crisis and co-response teams during that tenure. And I'm responsible for our clinical quality and our clinician trainings here. Read the research on mental illness and gun violence and the history of attempts at legislation to address gun violence. I want to be clear, I'm not myself a researcher or epidemiologist in this field specifically, so that's the context that I reflect on this. I would say that there are two main considerations of this legislation relative to behavioral health. Given the expanded red flag provisions in the legislation, we as behavioral health providers are thinking, okay, what are the rights and responsibilities of behavioral health clinicians, and how do we implement these in the most ethical and appropriate manner? In order to understand that, it's really helpful for us to understand the connection between mental illness and gun violence. There's a lot of dialogue about that in the public square and about the connection between the two, and it's important for us to look at the data as we try to come up with policies and protocols. So to address the second issue first, the relationship between mental illness and gun violence is complicated. And yes, as Chair González said, looking back on people who'd committed mass violence with firearms, a high percentage of those people had been seen by mental health providers and or had mental health diagnoses. It's important to recognize that studies have shown that the incidence of violence is only moderately higher in individuals with diagnosed mental illness than in the general population. But as a side note, that's not the perception of the general public. So there was a 2013 National Public Opinion Survey that found that 46% of Americans believe that persons with serious mental illness were far more dangerous than the general population. Epidemiologic studies show that mental illness is strongly associated with increased risk of suicide, which accounts for over half of US firearm-related fatalities. And as Rep. González said, there certainly is disproportionate rates of firearm use for violence versus suicide, violence against others versus suicide in Western Massachusetts by county. The large majority of people with serious mental illness are never violent. So how are we to implement the red flag laws in a way that is ethical, legal, effective, and sensitive? So a couple other thoughts about that. The National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, which included over 30,000 individuals in the United States, found that 2.9% of persons with serious mental illness alone committed violent acts in a year, compared to 0.8% of people with no mental disorder or substance use. So that is a statistically significant relative risk, even though it's a low absolute risk. But those with co-occurring substance use and serious mental illness had a higher rate of violence, so 10%. But still, 9 out of 10 times, if what we're just looking at is folks who have a combination, for example, of depression and alcohol use disorder, if we're using that as our instrument or tool to say that there's a risk here, 9 out of 10 times we're going to be wrong. So looking with a more sensitive lens, there are 2 specific diagnoses that appear to have higher odds of violence: antisocial personality disorder, and as I mentioned, substance use disorder with or without another mental health diagnosis. Studies have also found a substantially increased risk of violent behavior within particular demographic subgroups, specifically younger individuals, males, those of lower socioeconomic status, those who've been exposed to violence in their communities, and again, those having problems involving alcohol or illicit drug use, with or without the presence of another mental illness such as schizophrenia or depression. Another important factor is if we look at different treatment settings, there's meta-analytic studies have found that the lowest rates of violence on average are in folks who with mental illness and substance use who are in outpatient levels of treatment. That's 8%. There's a higher average rate are seen in studies of folks who have recently been hospitalized, which is at 13%, and those who present for psychiatric emergency settings at 23%. So that's relevant for us as one of the behavioral health psychiatric emergency providers, that is going to be a place where we are more likely to see the confluence of factors which would cause somebody to actually engage in violent acts, violent and illegal acts with firearms. So as Chair González indicated, in Hampden County, we have higher rates of gun violence against others. And in the more rural counties of Western Mass, the higher rates of guns related to violence is more related to suicide. So just a word about self-inflicted gun violence. The research indicates that at least half of those who die by suicide have a mental health or substance use disorder. But these disorders are often unrecognized or undiagnosed, which is the other problem. When we retrospectively look at mass violence or suicide by guns, we say, oh yeah, we can see symptom profiles of mental health conditions. But the likelihood that those individuals had been seen or diagnosed in advance, at least people who die by suicide, only about half had been identified. Among those with a mental health diagnosis, the flip side, fewer than 5% are likely to die by suicide. Firearms is the most lethal form of suicide. So again, in conclusion, it's too broad a generalization to say that people with mental illness are more likely to use firearms to cause harm to themselves or others. But certainly, as Chair González said, looking back on people who had committed violent crimes with firearms, a high percentage of those had been seen by mental health providers or had a mental health diagnosis. It's also true there are many more people who present with the same risk factors who never engage in violent behavior. And because many people who commit violence are never seen by mental health professionals, including schools and other medical providers, is a really important vector for identifying and keeping the community safe. So providers like BHN, we're going to have to look at lots of combinations of certain mental health diagnoses when they co-occur with substance use disorders and other risk factors, including exposure to violence, level of care that people are being treated in, and such. Also being mindful of the impact of bias based on our own perceptions of where people are coming from. So we'll have to weigh the risk factors to determine when to break confidentiality and act in a way that removes clients' rights and protects the community. Another last thought is that we do this every day in the behavioral health space with regard to Section 12, which allows and requires us to break confidentiality and civilly commit someone to mental health treatment against their will. We also have this responsibility with regard to TerraSoft, or the duty to warn, which basically in that regard is a more blunt tool for us, which says that if a client states a specific intent to harm someone else, they have a plan and a target, we break confidentiality and report that. We also have the tool of Section 35 commitment for substance use, which is when they have substance use, which is significant enough to put them at significant risk. This legislation gives us the right and the responsibility to engage a more nuanced risk level. So using risk assessment tools in our clinical judgment, do we believe that someone is at high risk for inflicting violence on themselves or someone else with a firearm? I want to say also, it is of course not the decision of the behavioral health provider, it's the decision of the judge. So it is our duty to flag, as the rules red flag, it's our duty to flag and let the courts decide. So as a provider, our next steps at BHN is to really engage experts within and beyond Massachusetts There are other states that already have clinicians, mental health and medical clinicians built into their extreme risk prevention order process. So we will be engaging experts within and beyond Massachusetts in partnership with our legislators to understand best practice and risk assessment tools, policies, and to create training for our staff. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks so much. Well, thank you, each of you, for your perspectives. Now, if anyone wanted to add anything else before we go to the Q&A, I'd like to offer a moment for that as well. There you go, Chair. Yep.
I would like, if possible, to just add one more slide that I failed to put up there. But
Sure.
you know, and it's one on the concentration that we made to make sure that we had tools for law enforcement, as well as some of the ones that Deputy Chief Kent mentioned. When it comes to reckless discharge of a firearm that he alluded to as well, that's a minimum of 2.5 years now. So spraying weapon at a building is reckless, and sometimes it has happened when you're trying to go after one person and some innocent bystander. Dealers selling to unlicensed buyers could go up to a 10-year minimum. Possession of untraceable firearms is a felony in a felony act, 2.5 years. False information on a license application, and we saw that with Hunter Biden, and how many individuals saw that as a way of people falsely presenting themselves in a way to obtain licenses. Possessions of firearms while under the influence. It's another concern that came up during our sessions throughout the state, and we addressed that, 2.5 years. Possession of firearms in prohibited areas, as we highlighted already. Knowingly possessing an untraceable firearm. So I know that some individuals have been able to remove the serial numbers from the weapons by scraping them off. And transporting firearms into Massachusetts for a criminal act, 5 years. Transporting firearms in Massachusetts to sell to an authorized person, again, also has some up to 10 years. Possession of an untraceable firearm, which I just alluded to, and failure to register a firearm, which we've already discussed, and possession of large capacity magazines, which I think Deputy Chief addressed that that's a good tool that they're using today now. And failure to surrender firearms under emergency protective orders. We also address that so as to the mental health concerns when and if it is adjudicated that somebody has some mental health issues or facing some difficult time in their life, that they need to hand in their weapons, and once and if the process goes through, they get all those weapons back. And we also added that they can provide a third party for those weapons to be turned over to for that period of time.
Thank you. Thank you for including that information. So just a reminder to participants, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom. And we did actually get questions when people registered, so that was very helpful. So the first the question that is in the Q&A now says, can you clarify when and what would make a black powder weapon one that needs to be registered? I have heard from hunters some issues, so I don't know if who's the respondent for that.
I have to defer on that one.
Okay.
Yeah. I was going to defer to Deputy Chief. Black powder, but I know that black powder weapons have not been, in my opinion, impacted. They were all grandfathered in, so anybody that had one, it wouldn't impact. And if it did change, we would have to get back to that person.
Okay. And we will answer the questions that come in over the next 15 minutes. And if we can't answer them right now, we will find the answers and post them when we send out the recording and the slides. The next question it says, we appreciate all the perspectives presented here. I was wondering if there was any conversations regarding industry accountability and how we can hold gun makers accountable for the harm towards victims and their families. Did that come up at all in your engagement?
Well, I know in the legislative process, yes, it came up various times in many situations. It was even being addressed in the federal government at the time that we were going through the gun legislation process. And I think that's a conversation that we left out of the gun legislation because of the pushback that we received. And I know, the theory is that guns don't, kill people. People use weapons to kill people, et cetera. But I think that's an issue that may come up again in this state or other states. I know other states are tackling with that issue as well, but I think in the federal government, at some point, those issues may come up. And I think California did something to that effect, but it hasn't gone to the legislative cycle yet.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask a question that came in through the registration, which is, are there going to be changes that will affect the individuals that currently have a license to carry? And I believe you answered that, but could you just answer that one again?
No, if you have a license to carry and your local municipality chief or superintendent, it's my understanding that nothing changes unless there's a concern. And maybe deputy chief would be the best to answer that if they've seen any issues that have changed the right to possession, because those are authorized, I believe, by the chiefs of police.
Yes, well, partially. It also has to go through the state. We approve it, and then it goes down to the Firearms Records Bureau, and they kind of give the final say, and then they send it back to us. As far as the application process, we do hundreds, probably thousands. Yeah, we definitely do thousands a year here. And I haven't seen any difference in the application or renewal process, which is pretty much all I could speak to on that. It seems to be pretty much status quo as to what we've been doing for the past few years. We already required live fire per our policy. So, I mean, I think that if we hadn't already required it, that might have been a change in the process, but we've been requiring it from our applicants for years. So I haven't seen any changes.
All right, thank you. We've received a couple of questions regarding the red flag rule and how information about it is shared with judges or legal personnel or even police officers. And so Deputy Chief Kent, could you maybe speak to what do police officers know about the red flag law, and how can we make sure the public or other stakeholders are aware of this law?
So, to my knowledge, we have not had a red flag situation come up at the Springfield Police Department. We have, again, as I told you, we have probably tens of thousands of applicants and renewals every year. And I have yet to see a red flag situation come up. We do routinely suspend or revoke LTCs for various other reasons. And I would imagine that the process would be similar to that, where if a red flag issue came up and the judge, as I understand it, there has to be judicial approval. If we got judicial approval, would come in the form of an order from a judge, and we would, probably me, would have to sign off on the suspension or the revocation, and then it would be sent out with our patrol personnel to serve the suspension order, confiscate the firearms in the LTC until the matter was resolved through whatever the process is to resolve it judicially or otherwise. As I said, we do suspension and revocations all the time for various reasons. And the process is we will take your LTC and your firearms lawfully. We have the right to do that in these situations. And we store them in our property room with no cost to anybody. And if the situation gets resolved and you're entitled to these items back, you go see our property guys and they'll ensure that you'll get them back. I assume it'll be when this situation comes up, a red flag situation, and I'm pretty confident that at some point it will. It'll probably be handled just like we handle any other suspension or revocation.
Jessica, I can add to that if that's helpful.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm again, we haven't had this experience since behavioral health clinicians are added newly, but we've been reading the legislation and understanding how this is supposed to work. So my understanding is that Massachusetts ERPO, Extreme Risk Protection Order, family and household members, which has a very clear definition of lots of people can fall in that definition. Healthcare providers that provided healthcare services to the respondent within the preceding 6 months, principals or assistant principals of elementary schools or secondary schools, or administrators of a college or university where the respondent is enrolled. Also, the firearm owner's identification card licensing authority in that town may all file a petition. So the petitions are filed if we have that, and it allows the healthcare providers, the law clarifies that providers may disclose protected health information of the respondent only to the extent necessary for the investigation. So we would then submit that during normal business hours. A petition may be filed with the clerk's office of the district court. The court will schedule a hearing date within 10 days of the filing of the petition and order law enforcement to serve the respondent with a hearing notice. Upon receipt of the petition, the judge may issue an emergency ERPO that lasts for up to 10 days or until the hearing. And the ERPO is issued after a full hearing. If it is issued, it will remain in effect for up to 1 year. There is also provision for emergency ERPO to be issued if the court finds reasonable cause, if the person is posing a risk of causing bodily harm to themselves or others. And that can be issued during court hours or off hours. There are provisions in the protocol for all of those things. So that's our understanding of what the flow would be and how we as potential petitioners would fall into that.
Okay. Thanks, Kathy. Another question that came in through the registration, and maybe this was discussed in the information gathering part when the legislation was being put together, but how are guns getting into our communities, our city, when there are no gun distributors? Could you speak to that from a macro level?
Well, there are gun distributors in our city, and I mean, there are gun distributors in every surrounding city. I don't think, I don't think the fact that we only have one gun shop in Springfield really affects the illegal firearm possessor, right? We have a direct pipeline, which is Route 91 from Vermont and New Hampshire, where drugs travel up Route 91 northbound from Springfield and Holyoke routinely, and they're traded for firearms up in Vermont or New Hampshire, and the firearms come back down. We have ghost guns that are either 3D printed here or ordered through the internet. We have quite a few of those. We have firearms, quite a few stolen firearms that turn up that are stolen in house breaks. Breaks into firearm stores, which are probably a lot more common than people think, where someone will go and break into a gun store, and take off with 25, 30 firearms. It happened in West Springfield a couple of years ago, but happened up in Ware, It happens more frequently than a lot of people think. And there's just, I've heard it said that there's over 400 million firearms in circulation in the United States. And I mean, to track 400 million of anything would be a Herculean task. So I know that there's guns out there floating around, and at one point, well, there's a lot of guns out there floating around, and at one point were legally purchased years and years ago that have been handed down and somehow found their way into the hands of a criminal. I guess my answer would be they come from all different places.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then on that note, a question says, can you speak to the increase in juvenile gun possession? And are those guns traceable?
Well, obviously the ability to trace a firearm is significant to the firearm, not the offender. So juvenile firearms are traced the same as adults caught with illegal firearms. The tracing method doesn't change based on the offender. I could probably go on for days about the juvenile justice system and accountability and lack of accountability, and how we're not holding these kids responsible for the minor crimes, which then turn into larger crimes because there hasn't been any accountability. I will tell you that, just off the top of my head, by reviewing reports, which I do every day when I come to work, we are seeing an increase, and I don't have the exact number, but just based on my perception from reading every report that comes through this place, an increase in juveniles carrying firearms, including we have an epidemic of juvenile car breakers in the city and car thieves. I'm sure you've all heard about the Kias and the Hyundais and how they're easy to steal and blah, blah, blah. But an alarming trend that we're seeing now is these juveniles are breaking into these cars, and if they're caught by the homeowners, they're confronting the homeowners with firearms when the homeowner comes out and says, "Get out of my car," to the point where we had somebody shot at last week. A homeowner was just trying to prevent his car from being stolen. So I would say that we are seeing an increase in juveniles carrying firearms and the willingness of those juveniles to use these firearms.
Thank you. And then the last question I just want to call out is, when will ERPO training be ready for school district officials and the wider population of medical providers? Is that something that who is responsible for sort of training stakeholders with regard to the red flag rule? And does anyone happen to know?
I don't know. I would assume that would be a state responsibility. We have Springfield police officers in all our schools, so I would assume that if a school administrator or employee had a problem, they would go to, or a question regarding this, they would go to one of the police officers assigned to their schools, and that police officer should be able to get the information through me or somebody here at the building in the police department.
Okay. All right, well, we are at time. Thank you so much, everyone. We will answer these questions. Again, like I said, the ones that we didn't get to, we will find the answers and post them with the rest of the recording and the slides. We would appreciate it if people would just take a minute and answer the survey. But again, want to thank you so much, Chair González and Deputy Chief Ken and Dr. Kathy Mague from BHN. We are just very grateful for the start of the dissemination of this information. And of course, there will be more conversations to come. But thank you so much for your time. And we will follow up with everyone, like we said, with some final product. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you.